Elizabeth, and we're going to talk about fermenting things today. So I'm going to show you a skeleton recipe for the most simple ferment of a vegetable that you can do. Today I'm going to use radishes. Radishes ferment beautifully, but you can use this same method to ferment cauliflower or carrots. Green beans, dilly beans is a version of this. This whole recipe is actually based on a recipe from my grandmother for cucumber pickles, which is basically this, but with dill and garlic added and cucumbers instead of radishes. But I have radishes today. I just thinned them out from the garden, and I have this many of them, so this is the size jar I'm going to use. You can do this method in any size jar. I recommend wide mouth jars for a couple different reasons, mason jars, for a couple different reasons. The main reason for using wide mouth jars, it's easier to create an airlock seal in a wide mouth jar. So you can do 32 ounce size, or 32 ounce size, 12 ounce size, or you can go all the way up to double size, and it all works the same. You just have to change the volume of salt that you use accordingly. So depending on how much vegetable you have, choose your size jar. The jar should be clean before you start. It doesn't need to be new. So, get your vegetables in your jar. They should be in bite-sized pieces. You can ferment them whole if you want. I'm fermenting these whole because they're not very big. But if you're starting with a huge honkin' radish or a whole head of cauliflower, you might want to chop it up. Here are some radishes that I fermented. These were big watermelon radishes that I fermented a couple weeks ago, and I chopped them into pieces about this size. I don't recommend narrow mouth jars because it's harder to do the airlock situation on them. Okay, green beans work well. You can chop them into about this size. Great. So we have our vegetable, and we're going to put it in salty water and leave it at room temperature. That's basically how you ferment things. You don't need to inoculate it with sauerkraut or whey. You can, but it doesn't make that much of a difference. If your vegetables are reasonably fresh, or even if really they're not, they should have enough of the correct bacteria on them already to thrive if you give them the right environment. What is the right environment? So I already talked about salt, water. We're going to talk about temperature, and we're going to talk about how much oxygen can get in. So what temperature does it need to be? Somewhere between 60 and 75, 80 degrees. Lower than 60, they'll ferment very slowly. Higher than 80, you can have some of the wrong species of bacteria start to proliferate, and it'll go too fast and get a little bit mushy. So within that range of 60 to 80, you can sort of keep an eye on the time. The hotter it is, the faster it'll go. The colder it is, the slower it'll go. So for these time estimates, you can sort of add more time if it's colder and less if it's warmer. Right now it's about 70 in my house, so I'm going to start checking on these after about 6 days. Okay. We've got our vegetable in the jar. We've talked about temperature. We're going to talk about how much salt now we're going to add. So the salt is important because the salt creates the right environment for the bacteria that you want to grow in here, and it inhibits the bacteria that you don't want to grow. How much salt depends on the size jar that you're using. This method is the easiest way that I know of to put the right amount of salt in. So for a 12-ounce jar, you're going to use a teaspoon of salt. For a 32-ounce jar, you're going to use a tablespoon. That's it. You take your teaspoon of salt and you plop it in on top of your vegetables. That's it. You can dissolve it ahead of time, but I find that that's not necessary. And then you put water on top. You might ask what kind of salt is important to use. Non-iodized is best. My grandmother used iodized salt, and it still worked for her, but it's better not to use iodized salt because it's bad for the bacteria. What kind of water? I live in Portland, Oregon. We have great tap water. I use tap water. If you lived somewhere where the tap water had some problems or you were worried about it, you could use distilled water or purified water of some kind. Okay, we've got our vegetables in the brine, and now we want to make sure that they stay under the brine, because if they poke out above, then they're exposed to the air, and then they might mold instead of fermenting. So there's several different ways to do this. I find the easiest, if you don't have any fancy equipment, is to take a weight, and I love jars of this size to use as a weight for this, and you just set it on top. That's it. With this method, of course, you are going to need to check on it occasionally and make sure that the water level hasn't dropped too low from evaporation, so you might need to top it off with water occasionally. But that's one method. Since I ferment things a lot, I have moved on to, I got a couple weights, but these really do the same thing as that. You don't really have to worry about it too much, but I put these in, and then I have some airlock lids that I purchased from Amazon, but you don't need these to make a ferment work, so I'll put that on. And that just sort of ensures that you have less oxygen going on. So now we have our ferment ready to go, and we're just gonna let this sit here for about 6 days until the brine turns cloudy and there's some bubbles rising. You might get bubbles rising out of the top. If you've overflowed, if you've filled your container up pretty high, you might want to put it on a plate when you set it out to ferment. And after about 6 days, you can start tasting it. When it tastes good to you, it'll taste salty and a little bit sour. You can take your airlock top off if you had one and replace it with just, you can take out the weight, replace it with a regular mason jar top and store it in the fridge, and it'll last for about 2 or 3 months. And you're ready to go.